At its peak, Toys R Us operated over 1,600 stores across 38 countries. It controlled roughly 25% of the American toy market. Revenue exceeded $11 billion a year. It was, by every measure, the undisputed empire of play. And then it was gone. Not slowly, not gracefully. 800 stores closed in a matter of months. 33,000 employees lost their jobs. The brand that had defined childhood shopping for 2 generations filed for liquidation in March 2018. But the collapse of Toys R Us did not begin with Amazon. It did not begin with Walmart. It began with a single financial decision made 17 years before the final store went dark. The story starts in 1948 in Washington, D.C. Charles Lazarus was a 25-year-old veteran running his father's bicycle repair shop. He noticed that the parents coming in weren't just buying bikes. They were asking about cribs, strollers, baby furniture. Lazarus pivoted. He opened a baby furniture store. Then he added toys. By 1957, he had a new idea: a supermarket, but not for food, for toys. He called it Toys R Us, with the backwards R that children would remember. The concept was radical for its era. Instead of small toy sections in department stores, Lazarus offered an entire warehouse devoted to play. Thousands of products, floor to ceiling, at discount prices. Volume over margin. Selection over service. It worked because Lazarus understood something the department stores missed. Parents would drive further and spend more time in a store that gave their children an overwhelming experience of choice. The toy department wasn't a side business. It was the destination. Through the 1960s and 70s, Toys R Us expanded aggressively. By 1983, the company was doing over $2 billion in sales. By the early 90s, it had passed the 800 store mark domestically and was expanding internationally. The company's purchasing power was so enormous that toy manufacturers essentially built their production schedules around Toys R Us orders. Geoffrey the Giraffe became one of the most recognized brand mascots in America. "I don't want to grow up. I'm a Toys R Us kid" wasn't just an advertisement. It was cultural architecture. An entire generation associated the act of wanting toys with one specific destination. At the peak, in the mid-1990s, Toys R Us held around 25% of the total US toy market. No single competitor came close. The empire appeared permanent. But there was a structural problem hiding in the numbers. The big box format that had made Toys R Us revolutionary in 1957 had become ordinary by 1995. Walmart and Target had expanded their own toy aisles dramatically. They didn't need toys to be profitable on their own. Toys were traffic drivers, loss leaders, a reason for parents already buying groceries and household goods to add a birthday present to the cart. Toys R Us couldn't compete on that logic. Toys were their entire business. Every square foot had to justify itself. But Walmart could sell the same action figure at a loss and make the margin back on paper towels in the same trip. By the late 90s, Toys R Us was losing market share steadily. Same-store sales were declining. The stores themselves had grown dated. Fluorescent lighting, cluttered aisles, inventory stacked without theater. The magic was leaking out. Then came the decision that sealed everything. In the year 2000, Toys R Us signed an exclusive 10-year deal to become the sole toy vendor on Amazon's website. At the time, it seemed logical. The company would handle online toy sales through the largest emerging e-commerce platform without building its own digital infrastructure from scratch. But the deal collapsed within a few years. Amazon began allowing other toy sellers onto the platform, violating the exclusivity that Toys R Us believed it had been promised. Toys R Us sued. They eventually won the lawsuit and exited the agreement in 2006. But the damage was catastrophic. The company had spent 6 critical years without developing its own e-commerce capabilities. By the time it tried to build a standalone online presence, Amazon had already captured the digital toy market. And then came the leveraged buyout. In 2005, a consortium of private equity firms, Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust, acquired Toys R Us for $6.6 billion. The deal was funded overwhelmingly with debt. The company, which had been publicly traded and modestly leveraged, was suddenly carrying over $5 billion in long-term obligations. This is the mechanism that ultimately destroyed the empire. Not Amazon, not Walmart. Debt service. After the buyout, Toys R Us was paying roughly $400 million a year in interest alone. $400 million that could not go toward store renovations, could not go toward e-commerce development, could not go toward price competition with Walmart, could not go toward the experiential retail concepts that might have differentiated the brand. The company was frozen in place by its own capital structure. Every dollar of operating profit went to feeding the debt, not building the future. Meanwhile, the toy market itself was shifting. Children were aging out of physical toys earlier. Tablets, smartphones, and video games were capturing attention that once went to action figures and board games. The total addressable market for traditional toys was not collapsing, but it was not growing either. And the competition for what remained was intensifying every year. By 2017, Toys R Us was generating roughly $11.5 billion in global revenue, but the debt load had barely decreased. The stores were aging. Online sales remained a fraction of what they needed to be. And then the holiday season underperformed. In September 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, initially hoping to restructure. The plan was to close underperforming locations, renegotiate leases, and emerge leaner. It did not work. Vendors lost confidence. Toy manufacturers began demanding cash on delivery rather than extending credit. Without inventory flowing freely, stores emptied during the critical holiday season. Customers saw bare shelves and assumed the end was near. The assumption became self-fulfilling. In March 2018, Toys R Us announced the liquidation of all U.S. operations. 735 stores would close. 33,000 jobs would disappear. Jeffrey the giraffe, the mascot that had welcomed children for decades, appeared in farewell advertisements that went viral not because of marketing strategy, but because millions of adults suddenly realized their childhood was being dismantled in real time. The aftermath scattered in several directions. The brand name was eventually acquired by a new entity, True Kids, which attempted small-format revival stores. Some international operations continued under different ownership structures. The real estate was absorbed. The employees received no severance, triggering congressional attention and public outrage. The private equity firms, meanwhile, had already extracted hundreds of millions in advisory fees, dividends, and transaction charges over the 12 years of ownership. The lesson of Toys R Us is precise. A leveraged buyout can convert a struggling but viable company into a structurally doomed one. When you load $5 billion of debt onto a retailer already losing market share, you do not just limit its future options, you eliminate them entirely. Every strategic response, better stores, lower prices, digital investment, experiential retail requires capital. And when all your capital services debt, the only available strategy is slow decline managed quarter by quarter until the structure finally gives way. Toys R Us did not collapse because children stopped wanting toys. It collapsed because the company could no longer afford to be the place where they found them.